As we know, Mexico is in a very dire crisis, socially and economically, with more than 70,000 deaths, and that's a very conservative estimate. An unprecedented situation never before seen through the drug trafficking, indiscriminate shooting of people, whether it was in Juarez, where dozens of people were shot, in substance abuse clinics, just gunned down, or the youth in Ayotzinapa, kidnapped, probably murdered, and in the search for their presence, wherever they may be, because the parents have not accepted that they are dead, there have been mass graves uncovered, dozens and dozens of people, and of course many, many more across the country we don't know about. There's extreme corruption, and to read the paper of Mexico, or Proceso, or La Jornada, and you read about the role of governors, the heads of state congresses, of the army, of high officials who are so linked, involved very much in the narco-trafficking. There's a great fear in the communities due to the instability and the insecurity. And what is the cause? Is Mexico a hopeless situation? Has it always been that way? And what is the answer to Mexico's crisis? First, it's important to look at its modern history, the most recent history of the last century, and its role in Latin America, being a leader historically, and at the same time sharing a border with the United States, which is a dual character, that is, being part of Latin America, but being next to the United States. In fact, having lost half of its country to the United States. And the U.S., throughout Mexico's modern history, has intervened continually, whether through outright theft of almost half of Mexico in 1846, or the invasion in Veracruz, or the invasion in 1914 in northern Mexico, supposedly against Pancho Villa, or the more permanently damaging economic and political invasion, stealing Mexico's resources and dictating Mexico's politics in the last 25 years. It may be hard for people to realize today, for someone who's not aware of the past, someone who takes a snapshot of Mexico today, but Mexico was for many years the political center of Latin America in the 20th century. It was highly regarded, even though with the contradiction of internal repression, of course, it's a capitalist country. There was repression against workers, students, peasants. It's a capitalist country, but yet Mexico was seen by many as a place of refuge, whether it was the probably 30,000 refugees after Spain's Civil War of 1936 to 1939, who were able to find refuge in Mexico, or the great revolutionary Trotsky, or other people, down to William Morales, a Puerto Rican revolutionary who escaped from U.S. clutches and Mexico refusing to extradite him to the U.S., where he lives now in Mexico. So it had, with Benito Juárez's great saying about respect for sovereignty is the road to peace. Can someone say that in Spanish? Sí. Yes. And it was recognized for having an independent position, even with U.S. pressure, intervention, sometimes the policies that reflected U.S. demands with respect to U.S. imperialist demands. For example, in 1962, when the U.S.-dominated Organization of American States, the OAS, under the U.S. direction, decided to expel Cuba for being communist. Because of its revolution, Mexico refused to go along. And many Latin American revolutionaries also were able to find exile in Mexico. And Mexico was known for, of course, the famous, great historic expropriation of its oil in 1938, for the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to 1917. And so why has it come to this point of almost some would consider a failed state. It's not, but yet it's an enormous crisis for the working class. Not just the issue of security, but the poverty that people are experiencing. Poverty that's growing despite sitting on some of the greatest wealth of this hemisphere, the oil and all the other resources. It's a very rich country in resources. First, of course, Mexico, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which broke out after 35 years of right-wing, very repressive government of the late 1800s and early 1900s, of Porfirio Diaz, of Porfiriato, which enabled U.S., British, and French and other imperialist, later imperialist governments to be able to take over so much of Mexico's wealth. And it led to the creation of great land holdings by foreigners, mostly foreigners, in the form of haciendas, ranches which held, and plantations, sugar, Henneken plantations, which held literally tens of millions of acres of land. And the poverty of the peasantry, which was mostly peasant at the time, the enrichment for the U.S. banks, and the Porfirio Diaz regime was basically comprador bourgeoisie, meaning completely sold to U.S. and foreign capital. It did create development, infrastructural development, the railroads from like 200 miles to 12,000 miles of railroad, the mine development, but it was all wealth that went for the extraction of resources to the U.S. and abroad. So the 1910 revolution was a revolution primarily for land. And it was a very violent revolution of different forces. Of course, we know of the famous Emiliano Zapata in the South, who was leading and had a great reputation as a peasant leader from his little town of Anenequilo, and Pancho Villa in the north, who temporarily joined forces, but the first leader of the Mexican Revolution, the first provisional president, was Francisco Madero, who was the one who made the call for the revolution in November 20th, 1910. And it's interesting to study that, the early part of the revolution, I won't go into detail, because it really has so much reflection today, and why it is that in 1994, when the Zapatista uprising took place, why, and when you see in the U.S. movement too in Latin America, why Zapata is such a revolutionary figure and a hero. Because even though Madero had called for a revolution against the Diaz regime, he himself had come from the capitalist class. He came from a wealthy family, and it was really a struggle for him, the capitalists of Mexico, against the foreign ownership and intervention. But Zapata found himself, even though he initially supported Madero, realized that what Madero was calling for was still respecting private property. And what Zapata was demanding, and the people around him were demanding, was an immediate return of the land to the peasantry, to the indigenous people, of land that had always belonged to them and had been stolen. And that's why his Plan de Ayala, that became a real rallying cry too for the Chicano movement in the United States of the 60s and 70s and so on. And that's why the Zapatistas named themselves after him. But the revolution ended with a constitution of 1917, which had very historic development in it. It was the first revolution, by the way, of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution surpassed it in being a socialist revolution and was in 1917. But the Mexican Revolution was known for the question of land, Article 27, which declared that the land, the subsoil, the resources belonged to Mexico, even though it wasn't really implemented then in 1917. Article 123 was the right of workers to an 8-hour day, the right to organization, and so on. Again, it was on paper, and there was some reform but it wasn't really, the real major progress did not come until the administration of Lázaro Cárdenas from 1934 to 1940. Jumping to that time, when you want to understand some of Mexico's history of the 20th century, it's good to look at our own history, because there are many parallels for the working class that were taking place then, here and there, including even in the 1980s and today. What happened in 1929 was the great capitalist crisis, the World Depression, the Great Depression as we call it here, where the overproduction and the competition among the capitalists had gone to such a fever pitch that suddenly they found themselves without markets. The markets were saturated. The corporations collapsed. Some, others became richer later. And the banks, many banks collapsed, but the working class suffered most of all. In the US, it was at least 25% unemployment, massive unemployment in Mexico, and employment dried up. The poverty was so great. The sugar prices worldwide, Mexico was a major sugar producer, Heineken, as I said, and the world prices of sugar dropped to like a penny a pound. It wasn't even worth growing. And so hundreds of thousands of workers, for example, found themselves with no income. That was the Depression. And out of that depression, whether it was Mexico or Cuba even, or the United States, came great workers' movements and struggles of workers and farmers, workers and peasants. And it was in the 1920s, late 20s, the 30s, that the workers' movements in many countries of the industrialized, capitalist world, in Mexico too, took on great strength. There were strikes, there were demands from the oil workers, and under the administration of Lázaro Cárdenas, who was a general in the late 1920s, he became president in 1934. In Mexico, there's no re-election, it's a 6-year term. And his presidency was interesting because he spent at least 2 years traveling throughout the country beforehand to see what was taking place, became very identified very much with the suffering of people, and saw the demands, the organization, the struggles that were taking place, so that when he became president, his term was marked by really a reflection and a ratification of what the workers were demanding. He didn't create it himself, just like here in the US. We saw that the Roosevelt administration signed Social Security, right? The right to Social Security, the right to labor unions, the Wagner Act of 1934 or 35. Many great reforms, unemployment insurance, that all came about in the 1930s as a result of years of suffering from the capitalist crisis. And the same thing happened in Mexico under the Cárdenas government of social reforms. One of them, the biggest one at the time, was land in which at least 45 million acres of land was distributed to the campesinos. The realization of what was in the Constitution of 1917, of the ejido, of the collective land, in which until the Salinas government of the 1980s, much land was held collectively, where it wasn't just divided up in little parcels, which was inefficient and would just result in poverty later, that the ejidos were collective land holdings for the villages of the people to be able to benefit from collective agricultural production. And 45 million acres were distributed, big haciendas were broken up, but in 1936, the oil workers, there were a number of different major oil productions, refineries that were held, as I said, by Standard Oil, by British, by the Dutch, by the French, that the oil workers demanded some 66 million pesos in wage increases because they lived under poverty wages. And they knew that the oil companies were making enormous wealth off of their production. And so they demanded 66 million pesos. There was a struggle of months. They went on strike. They went on various strikes unsuccessfully, but they took it to eventually the Supreme Court. The oil companies said, we don't have the money, and we're not going to give it to you. They offered something like 14 million pesos instead of 66 million. And finally, when it came to a heated battle, the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled that the workers were justified. They didn't grant them 66 million, probably I think a little less than half. And the oil companies refused. So on March 18, 1938, a holiday to this day in Mexico, Cárdenas was on the radio and he announced the nationalization of Mexico's oil. That was the 18th. 2 days later, hundreds of thousands of people filled the Zócalo, the main square inside of Mexico City, because a call had been made by Cárdenas, donate what you can to help us they were going to compensate the oil companies for the expropriation. And people were rallied to that call, brought in jewelry, what vessels they had, money, even chickens, whatever they could produce, whatever they could donate to contribute to this great, inspiring victory for the people of Mexico. It's important to know that because the Mexican Revolution was not socialist, because it continued as capitalist, and the lesson for us, no matter what reforms are won under capitalism, and the reforms will always take place when the people fight for it, right? It's never handed to us by leaders. They're always subject to being taken away. And they will be taken away if the working class doesn't continue in its struggle and defense, and when the capitalists are able to reorganize and take back what the workers have won in struggle. And that's what we're seeing in the United States and what we're seeing in Mexico. That despite this great oil wealth, Mexico is now extremely indebted, heavily indebted, mainly because of the oil, mainly because of it being under a capitalist regime, and the intervention and the so-called rescue by U.S. banks. So that was, I bring up the 1930s because of what was possible, what reigned all the way until the 80s in terms of the social programs, social guarantees that people had. Over time, Mexican agriculture was supported by the government through subsidies. Corn was produced by small farmers, by people who had little plots of land, or by the ejido production. Corn was ubiquitous through Mexico. Mexico fed itself by its own corn. And of course, it's a legacy of the indigenous people throughout Latin America, the issue of corn. And that has been pretty much wiped away by the Nafta Agreement of 1994. So I want to go so because of Mexico's oil, the expropriation and nationalization of its oil, it was able to engage in a lot of development for the country. It went from being an extremely poor, underdeveloped country with most of the wealth owned by the foreigners to being one in which by the early 1980s, almost 1,200 industries, whether it was mining, the airlines, the railroads, the land, you name it, anything involving production was state-owned, was nationalized, which enabled, even though it was capitals, it enabled the country to develop its domestic economy and for the people to benefit. Things improved. Of course, there was always poverty, but the state ownership allowed the country to protect its internal production. U.S. production has always been higher. For example, corn, you look at the Midwest, giant plantations of corn in the United States, subsidized by the U.S. government. And so the U.S. farmers in their corn production have giant tractors, huge productive capacity per acre, and they could easily have wiped out Mexican corn as well as other agricultural production in the U.S. could have always wiped out Mexican corn, the same with industry. But Mexico, in protecting its economy domestically, had a policy of tariffs, for example, or subsidizing farmers in terms of their seed, fertilizer, and guaranteed prices. So it was able to provide stability for Mexico's food intake of corn, beans, essentials, and income for the farmers. That was very, very important. All this wiped out by NAFTA. And so tariffs, if anyone wanted to bring corn into Mexico, the farmers of the U.S. had to pay a high tariff, as well as any other product that came into Mexico. It required a tariff to protect domestic production and domestic ownership. But the problem for Mexico's economy was that one of the problems was that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the government started to take out enormous loans for the development because they couldn't just take oil income and say, okay, now we have the money, we're going to produce infrastructure or jobs or schools or so on. They took loans out because the price of oil was going higher and higher. The OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the struggle in the early 1970s allowed the countries that exported oil to demand a higher price. So Mexico seemed to be awash in income, money from oil. What happened? In 1981, the oil prices worldwide collapsed. And in addition, the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank raised its interest rate on foreign debt from 12 to 24%. So that, for Mexico alone, created a huge increase, more than double of its debt, a doubling of its debt overnight. The oil prices went from, I think, $30 to like $13 a barrel. It just crashed. And so in 1981, in 82, Mexico went into default for the first time. It was a huge blow to Mexico. And so Mexico from then became a subject of the banks, the U.S. banks, the International Monetary Fund. But Chase, you name all those banks. They've all changed now. I can't say a bank that hasn't become two banks. J.P. Morgan, it doesn't, what is J.P. Morgan now? Chase, okay, you know more than me. All those banks got a hold in Mexico in 1982. Just to give you an idea. When I was growing up, my mother's from Mexico. My dad's Mexican-American from southern New Mexico. But when I was growing up, we used to always see our cousins in Juarez and Camargo and Chihuahua and Parral, everywhere through Chihuahua. And I remember for so many years in our youth, the peso was 12.5 pesos to the dollar. It was that way forever. It was the Mexican economy was very stable. Just to give you a little snapshot, it fell drastically in the 80s. In 1994 December, it plummeted even more. By the 90s, it became like 10,000 pesos to a dollar. So what did they do? They just took off 3 zeros, readjusted it to say, okay, 10,000 pesos is too much to carry for a dollar. We'll just bring us your money, we'll give you 10 pesos. We'll just get rid of the zeros. Now it's 15.5, I think 15.7. Always realize it's 15,000 in reality. But that was the beginning of this modern crisis for Mexico, which has, I think, a big part of the reason why drugs was able to fill the vacuum. Okay. So the 1982 crash meant that Mexico had to basically beg for money from the U.S. banks. The U.S. banks were glad to do so, and the loans that they provided meant higher interest rates. The debt more than doubled to $80 billion. In the following 5 years, the economic gross, the gross domestic product, the production of the country dropped 11%, and real wages fell, well, officially 50%, but much more than that. Inflation 100% in 1 year alone. When you hear today about how they talk about the crisis of Venezuela and how it's just a disaster and a basket case and so on, and how it, the regime has to be changed and counter-revolution, they didn't say that about Mexico. They don't say that about all these other countries that have huge interest rates. It's just an excuse to attack Venezuela more. But during the De la Madrid government, De la Madrid was one of the presidents, and he was from 1982 to 1988. Even though Carlos Salinas in 1988 to 1994, very reactionary president, but even though he is regarded as the one who privatized much of the industry, brought it back to private ownership, who signed the Nafta Agreement. In fact, from 82 to 88, De la Madrid privatized hundreds of state-owned industries to deal with the demands of the banks, to be able to get income in order to pay the debt, which was never payable. The debt has increased year by year, even though it's been paid off several times. There were almost 1,200 state-owned industries, I said. It was reduced to only 400 by 1988. So he really began the process of handing over what used to be privately owned in the 1800s, rescued by the 1930s by the government, given back to private business, mostly foreign, but also Mexican billionaires. And by the 1980s, much of the state-owned companies were private. Some of those trade barriers, those tariffs that were imposed by Mexico were reduced. There was deregulation, there was social service cutbacks, and it's referred to, the 80s are referred to throughout Latin America as the lost decade, because it was throughout Latin America that the governments fell under huge debt to Western banks, mostly US, and ended up handing over much of their resources. Argentina, for example, sold everything off. It owned nothing by the time of the 1990s. So then by 1988, there was so much anger in the country because of the crisis that there was a presidential campaign. Carlos Salinas de Gortari, the PRI candidate, the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Mexico, which has ruled for many years. And then came Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, who had the reputation of being the son of Lázaro Cárdenas of the 1930s. And he had been a PRI member, but he was a liberal, and he formed with others something called the FDN, the National Democratic Front, which was a real challenge to the PRI rule. And it was an exciting campaign. People were so mobilized by it. In the left, some of the left parties were in crisis because they were on the ballot. There's a certain process of the election politics in Mexico. But I remember one party, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, PRT, they were a considerably large party. And I remember in those days before the election, because the Cuauhtémoc campaign was so sweeping, so popular, because it was a challenge to all this hand over to the banks kind of policy, and the PRI, that even in the PRT they said, they split basically. Many of their members left. because the PRT officially would not support Cuauhtémoc. And this shows how popular the campaign was. Well, the day of the elections, the electoral system shut down. They had an electrical problem, and the whole thing shut down for a day. And when it started back up, Salinas won by just a little bit more than 50%. Everyone says there was theft. There was major theft. You can always be assured that the U.S. government has intervened in these elections. One of the biggest interventions was 1994 to make sure that Cedillo, the presidential candidate at that time of the PRI, would win. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But I went there. I went there in the days after the election, and I remember I was at the Zócalo, that big square, and there were hundreds of thousands of people who came to challenge the vote, to demand that Salinas not take the presidency, that Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas had won. And people came from everywhere. I really believe that people were ready for struggle. They were ready for struggle. I'll never forget, I still have the pictures that I took. I was high up on a stage with the media in the middle. And it was kind of a shock because Cuauhtémoc, he came up with other leaders like, Heriberto Castillo and Rosario Ibarra, okay.
Yeah.
All these leaders, they all came onto the platform. Were you there, Juan?
Yeah.
And Cuauhtémoc spoke for 20 minutes and said, we're going to fight the electoral reform. And it was like a huge puncturing of a balloon. People were shocked. That was like it. And I think it's more, people were ready for a fight back. They were ready for a struggle, but it was really, it took the shape, the struggle by Cuauhtémoc took the form of fighting the electoral fraud, which really wasn't going to go anywhere. And it was a huge defeat. In 1988 to 1994, the Salinas regime was marked by the Nafta Agreement, by a complete selling off of the rest of state-owned property, except oil. That's the only thing that remains now. Telmex was privatized. The television, the mines, the airlines, those were what were sold off, the railroads. Especially the mines, Cananea, famous mine in the north. But the Nafta Agreement was what was a U.S. imperialist demand on the whole country. It spelled disaster for the country. And it meant the complete elimination of all protection of Mexico's domestic economy. It said that it would be a gradual and then complete elimination of any tariffs to protect its agriculture and industry. It meant that there could now be, through different mechanisms, foreign ownership of much of Mexico's land. And in other reforms of Salinas, Article 27, I remember Juan Jose, when you spoke at that time, you said, what was unthinkable became reality. That Article 27 was gutted. Article 27, the right to the land, the right to Mexico's ownership of its property. And what took place in the process was that, remember the ejidos, the collective land, people were given private title, families. Okay, you will now have a title to a piece of land. What happens in the next harvest when the subsidies of the government were eliminated? That was part of the demand. That was part of the pressure of the U.S. The government could no longer subsidize by providing seed or fertilizer at affordable prices to the farmer. Prices were no longer guaranteed. Subsidies were eliminated. And so then, very soon came the collapse of hundreds of thousands of farmers, small farmers. And if you then got a little piece of land, the next season, when you had no money left, you sold it. Who did you sell it to? A richer owner. And then came the private ownership of land, the monopolization of the land, and we saw the great advance and demand of the Mexican Revolution of the 1930s was gutted. It was unthinkable, but it happened. When Salinas was elected, it reminds me of Reagan, although he was a few years earlier. Again, think about the U.S. and what took place here. When Reagan was elected, what was the first battle that he took on against workers? Patco. For those of you who are too young to remember, or you who didn't remember because you weren't alive then, Patco, the Professional Air Traffic Control Organization. It was the 11,000 air traffic controllers of the United States. They had always prided themselves on not having a union. They were professional. But when it came down to it, they were super exploited. Hard work. They wanted better conditions, and they went on strike. And Reagan fired them all. And it was a shock to the people, the progressive movement, but the labor movement didn't defend them. The AFL-CIO said they shouldn't have gone on strike. They should have asked us for support. They're not even a member of our organization. And that showed to the U.S. government that the labor movement could be further attacked without much defense. The same thing happened in Mexico. There was a leader, Hernandez Galicia, La Quina was his nickname. He was the head of many decades of the Oil Workers Union. Very powerful. Sure, you can be sure that he was very privileged, corrupt, whatever. But he was a leader of the union and had taken on the government in many ways for the oil workers. As soon as Salinas became president, he arrested him. And that was like, it's a signal. Can we get away with it? Yeah, they did. They got away with it. And there was a weakness in the labor movement, the lack of a fight back, the lack of an independent fight back against the ruling class. The same in the United States, that labor has not been able to, even up to now, because now, for many years, the labor movement has just decided to get slapped for 4 years and then give tens of millions to the next presidential candidate. That's going to happen again in 2016. It's going to stop at some point, but I don't see it stopping in 2016. Anyway, that was a signal that Salinas could get away with a lot, and he did. 1994, January 1st, 1994, the signing of Nafta. And I remember I woke up that morning and we heard something on the news about an uprising in Mexico, in Chiapas. I heard Chiapas for the first time. And I went across the street to a Burger King, New Year's Day, they're open. And there was this very young man, he was Mexican, very, very poor. And he'd been in the streets of San Francisco for years as a shoe shine. And he was illiterate. And he was standing next to me at the stand, and this is the morning of January 1st, and I said, "Did you hear what happened in Chiapas?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "In Mexico." And he goes, "No, Chiapas isn't part of Mexico." Which really was an indication how isolated Chiapas was. Development didn't come to Chiapas. Years later, that same year, we went a few days later to see the uprising. We went to Chiapas, and the isolation, the poverty was so great. And no matter how much CIA and FBI intervention there had been in Mexico, especially since the 60s, they had no idea about the existence of the Zapatistas. And when they rose up that day, Subcomandante Marcos said, NAFTA is going to be a death sentence for the indigenous. And what Ramsey Clark said there when we went there to expose what had been happening against the indigenous, he said, this is a shot that will be heard around the world. And it was. The indigenous uprising of the Zapatistas was a great, great struggle of the indigenous of Latin America, Mexico, Latin America, and really shaped a lot of the consciousness, awoke the consciousness of not only the indigenous need to unite and fight for their rights, but also of Mexico's struggle, and also for many, many people. It was they were not able to win what they aimed to do, but it was very, very important that it took place on that day, the consciousness that they had. So I'm going to jump to one other point to show the increased control of the United States, banks and government over Mexico. A very dramatic break in Mexico's economy that didn't really get much news. It did briefly in the news, but this was in December. In August of 1994, after this disastrous administration of Salinas, where the media said, wow, what a great recovery for the Mexican economy. Inflation is down, the wealth has come back, but that was for the rich. The poor were poorer than ever. But the August 1994 presidential election campaign of Cedillo, I don't even know who the opposition was, but Cedillo was the PRI candidate again, and things seemed to be swimming along. What was not known at the time during his election was that became known later when the crisis hit, was that the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank pumped in tens of millions of U.S. dollars into the Mexican peso, into the banks, to hold up artificially the value of the peso, which had been dropping, to hold it up so that it would appear to be economic stability during the election campaign. Cedillo won, and by December was a huge meltdown of the economy, a default. Suddenly, the Mexican government announced that they had no money left, that their reserves were spent because of the interest rates that they had to pay for the foreign debt they had come due. And President Clinton went to Congress to seek a bailout. And when you see the news at that time, I remember because I wrote an article about it at that time, the international bankers, heads of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all these financiers said, this is going to be an earthquake, a shock that will hit all the world if Mexico is not rescued. If Mexico's economy is allowed to fail, it will be a disaster for everyone. Because when you think about it, the banks don't have the power if the people refuse to pay. And I want to say this, in 1985, with all these crises developing, Fidel made a call to the world, and especially to the Latin American leaders, and said, the debt should be canceled. It's unpayable. It's been paid over and over. And that call, still resonates. But it needed unity of all the economies, of all the governments to do so, because they've paid many, many times over. So what took place was Congress refused the bailout because the government of Mexico refused some of the conditions, which were extremely onerous. However, eventually they caved in. And the condition of the bailout was this. The IMF came in with billions, the Federal Reserve Bank came in with billions, but a condition of the bailout was that Mexico's oil reserves, they had these major oil reserves, had to be virtually handed over in ownership to the U.S. government. And from then on, all oil export revenue of Mexico had to be deposited into the New York branch of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank for its control and for profiteering off the money. All financial information of the government, of the economy, of the whole country, had to be immediately available and handed over to the U.S. Treasury Department on demand, anytime they asked for it, any internal information. In 1995, remember, this is all a result of the banks, the U.S. banks. The gross domestic product, the production of the country, dropped 7%, the greatest drop since the Great Depression of 1930s. And Salinas, who was seen as a great miracle maker with the Nafta and so on, feted in Washington by the U.S., a year after he left office, which is kind of like a sign of what was to come now. His brother Raul Salinas and his wife were arrested because they were trying to withdraw $84 million from Swiss banks, which they had been holding. Later it turned out they had deposited $95 million in I think Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, one of the New York banks, again I forget because of the mergers. They deposited $95 million. It was all drug money. They were involved in major, major drug dealing, but not just them. However, to show you how much these government leaders and their relatives were profiteering from drugs already. But it wouldn't be possible, and we have to point this out. It's not just the Mexican leaders, it's primarily the US banks and corporations which help fuel the drug economy, and of course the consumption in the United States. But without the bank's role of hiding these deposits, of profiteering from the deposits, of being an integral part of the drug economy, this couldn't exist. It's the profits. And if you can make a huge profit from drugs, police, corporations, leaders, they're all going to take part. That's why it's so corrupted. It's not just because it's not just a feature of Mexican society. It's deeply embedded in this society too. Salinas, it was just incredible to see that. He was convicted, later he was exonerated, but he was convicted of murdering his ex-brother-in-law, who was the head of the PRI at the time. But it's interesting that in 1985, the Reagan administration declared the U.S. war on drugs, which is why we have such a huge prison population in the United States. The people who use drugs, the people who are maybe like minor sellers in the street, they're in prison up to life in U.S. prison. 2 million people in U.S. jails. But the bankers who violated federal law, nothing happens to them. We have a great book, I don't see it on the bookshelf, but we have a great book on the role of the U.S. banks in the bank bailout of 2008 and their role in this drug trafficking, profiteering. I think maybe we have copies here. No, the booklet that was written by Richard Becker.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very good book that details some of the role of the banks in the narco-trafficking industry. So, again, the war on drugs, I was in Cuba in March and in May this year, and we had Johanna and I, we were there in March, and we got to have a great privilege of meeting with a leader of the Communist Party of Cuba, José Ramón Balaguer, and he's a longtime leader of the party, of the Cuban government, and he met with us for 2.5 hours, and he was talking about the unity of the ALBA countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, and the progress that's taken place in Latin America, of this great new era of the countries resisting U.S. imperialism. And we were talking about the issue of drugs, and he said, wherever the DEA has appeared, the drug industry has flourished. And that's true. The DEA being a drug enforcement agency. You saw just a few years ago that they were caught having exported hundreds and hundreds of automatic weapons into Mexico. And they were also involved in a major drug route through Mexico and through Europe. And they claimed that they were doing it just to find out where the drugs were going. They were very involved. They're very, very involved in it. And so when José Ramón Balaguer said that the DEA's presence means that the U.S. is involved, it's very true. But the crisis in Mexico, the people have paid the price for that. When Calderón became president in 2006, he declared a war on drugs. And that's when this major increase in the killings and the deaths took place. It has increased more and more and more. And they can call federal troops, they can call the army, any arm of the Mexican military, or the police, or deputize more police, and they are not able to root it out. How do you root out this crisis? We saw these young people from the Normalista school, Ayotzinapa, who I believe that they were targeted not just because they happened to be in the wrong place. You see so many of these killings, you wonder why were these people gunned down, why were they decapitated, why did meet this brutal, brutal murder. You know, kids on a high school bus going to, a few years ago, some high school kids on a bus were all slaughtered too. But I really believe that these youth of Ayotzinapa, who were part of this great tradition of the rural normalista, meaning teacher schools, which came from a very radical school. That's the nature of these schools. They were an opportunity for youth of the countryside, of the rural area, to have an opportunity to be a teacher. But these schools, especially that school, had a real culture of revolution, a revolutionary history, of talking about their roots, of talking about the need for struggle. And I really think that the mayor of the town where they were captured, where they were kidnapped, that all those leaders had a disdain and a hatred for what those youth represented, and it was a political killing. But there are dozens of many tens of thousands. And when, like I said, the crisis of Mexico, the loss of millions of jobs, the dropping into poverty of so much of the population, the loss of their economic sovereignty by the demands of the banks, which grow ever more. Now you see on the chopping block, it's already in process, the final selling off of Mexico's oil. But Mexico is still stuck with the debt. Whoever buys up the oil, whatever oil company is from French, US, British, whatever oil companies come in to efficientize the economy and privatize it and take over the ownership, they're not going to be saddled with Mexico's debt or everything that Mexico has paid for. Mexico needs revolution like the United States needs revolution. And it's an easy thing to say, but it's the only solution. And Mexico has a great, great revolutionary history, a history of many struggles. We see all the time, you just open up a newspaper from Mexico or look on the internet, and you see the people organizing, teachers. Right now, the teachers' union in Oaxaca, Guerrero, Michoacan are declaring a boycott for these upcoming June 7th. On Sunday, June 7th, will be elections for the 500 members of the lower house of the Congress and of a number of state governorships. A lot of these are very important elections. They're being called a referendum on Peña Nieto's presidency. Peña Nieto is a new president who people are so enraged at because of his lackadaisical attitude about the youth, his disdain for the people who are victims of the drug crisis, of the killings taking place, and his wealth that, you know, he's just like many others, he just becomes super rich. And it symbolizes the gap between rich and poor. But these elections are taking place, and the teachers' union, the CNTE, has declared a boycott. And it was really interesting in the news that the Electoral Commission said we better find a way to get these polling places placed somewhere else than the schools, because schools are a traditional place where people go to vote. Well, it's just part of a bigger problem. The people in a country have lost faith in the leaders. They don't have any respect for the politicians, for their parties. They don't care what reforms have come about. This is the first elections now that you don't have to belong to a party. This was an electoral reform of 2012, kind of a safety valve, to release some of this pressure. And before you had to belong to a party inscription, but now if you get enough signatures, you can be an independent candidate. Well, it doesn't change the nature of the elections to have some reform. It's still a system that uses elections to make people feel that if you vote, you had your say, and that's all you can do. We're told the same thing here. And the day that people lose their illusion of elections, capitalist elections, as meaning democracy, is a day that people are going to start taking things into our own hands, the masses, and organizing and fighting, which is the only way to win our rights. So I'm going to end it there. I've been talking too long. But I think it'd be great if Juan had said